We'd lived like ghosts on the edge of town for as long as I can remember. My life folded into the rows of corn that rose like a dark ocean behind the farmhouse. Marta and I ran a small corn operation outside Dryford, Nebraska, where the map thinned into gravel and telephone poles shrugged off the wires. The land is honest in its solitude. Long days of soil under the nails, nights that flatten sound until even breath seems loud. On paper, it was routine, the sort of life that makes people think in seasons instead of hours. Sow in spring, pray for rain in summer, harvest before the frost. In truth, that routine is a skin we wear to keep the cold out. On nights like the one in August 2018, that skin feels paper thin. That evening the sky had a low, bruised look. The rain had been working itself into the soil all day, leaving the air with that metallic, close smell that settles in your teeth. We'd had Hank and Ollie over neighbors the way rivers border one another, close enough to wave at, but far enough that visits were a small event. The four of us ate cold pizza on the porch, played a board game badly, and drank wine until our words smoothed out like a bad recording. When Hank and his wife left, stumbling pleasant, laughing at nothing in particular, it was nearly 11. Their truck's taillights were two small, receding planets down Dryford Road, and the farmhouse settled back into the soft wild of crickets and rain on the metal roof. Marta and I barely made it through the first half of our movie. The wine loosened us. She curled into me on the couch, and I let the film blur into the background, thinking of nothing more ambitious than sleep. The clock was a lazy thing on the wall when there came a knock, a polite, slow knuckle at the front door that seemed wrong for the hour. You never get visitors in the middle of nowhere, unless someone has broken down or someone has decided to break in. I turned down the sound and tilted my head, trying to place a voice beneath the rain. It sounded like someone, but muffled by the wet and the wood. "Hello," maybe. We listened, eyes meeting in the dim. 20 seconds later, the knuckles came again. This time there was a voice, thin and urgent. "We need help." It was a voice that keyed the primitive part of me. There is a protocol in farm life. Help the stranded, share a phone, offer a blanket. I stood up, the couch springs complaining, and moved toward the door. Marta grabbed my sleeve and shook her head, an immediate, reflexive no that said more than her words. "Don't open it." The defensiveness of living on a plot of land, with only a thin door between you and an expanse of empty road. She whispered she would call the police. I told her I would at least ask who it was. That felt like a compromise, soft and provisional, a way to assert control. When I asked who was there, a man's voice came back, strained by the weather. "Oh, thank God. Can you open up? We're lost." It felt right then to ask for proof. The sort of small test that marginally calm people use to keep from being terrorized by strangers. "Who's we?" I asked. "My wife and I," he said. I asked if the wife could speak, and the voice went flat for a beat. "She's not next to me right now," came the answer. Something in my chest tightened. The voice had an odd, upsung quality, like someone trying to make their words softer or higher. It could be the rain. It could be nothing. But living in a place that swallows sound makes you paranoid in ways that feel like intuition. For a desperate second I laughed because Hank had a penchant for stupid pranks, and I wanted to believe it was him. "Hank?" I called, half joking. The voice answered, but deeper. It wasn't Hank. The small relief I felt fell apart, and I walked to the phone. I called Hank anyway, partly to confirm, partly because calling someone late at night is a ritual that makes the world feel smaller. The phone rang 3 times. He picked up. "Are you at my front door?" I asked. "No." He said he was still on Dryford Road, not near us. He offered to come right away. We hung up. The rain kept its slow, steady pulse against the glass. Then the banging changed. It was harder now, hands knocking in a way that didn't belong to somebody politely tired. Through the wood, the voice came again. "We just need to use a phone, that's all." My throat had the dry silk of adrenaline. I remember yelling something about a shotgun without thinking it through. Part bravado, part a clear boundary. Don't come across this threshold. Marta's hand was trembling around the phone. She'd already reached 911 and was whispering into the line, giving our address like a prayer. The operator's voice became another box of sound between us and the threats. Calming, bureaucratic, far away. Footsteps creaked across the porch. Not one, but several too, distinct treads moving along the breadth of the wooden deck. They stopped at a window with the blinds down. A finger of light came between slats as someone tried to lift the window just enough to peer in. The sound of the glass being nudged is tiny, and at the same time enormous. It was the thin promise that someone could breach us with ease. Marta screamed into the phone, "Leave us alone!" I answered with my own roar, a coarse animal sound in the throat, and the words I had practiced during 100 possible confrontations. "Get the fuck off our property or I'll shoot." In the interstices of my shouts, something else crept in. The low, almost casual mutter of a voice calling from the road, "Open up!" It was Hank, actually shouting, and his cadence made it unmistakable. Relief rushed in like a sharp intake of breath. Relief that someone we knew had shown up. But that relief was a false tide. When we opened the door, a crack he pushed in beside me, shotgun in hand, eyes wide as if he'd driven the whole stretch scanning for headlights that weren't there. He said he hadn't seen anyone when he turned onto our lane. That detail lodged in me like a splinter. The idea that those voices could have been somewhere within earshot, near enough to knock and to mimic, but absent from the darkness where headlights would have shown them. We didn't sleep that night. We wrapped the house in human presence as best we could. Lights left on, a slow circuit of doors checked, a shotgun next to the bed like a newly grown thing. By dawn, when the rain had finally thinned and the corn whispered like an apology, the sky was a thinner kind of gray. The officer who finally came did a quick sweep of the property, his flashlight pinning nothing more than little animals and sodden leaves. He shook his head and advised cameras. He framed the suggestion like a sensible order, but his mouth made the suggestion into something like a prophecy. If someone wanted in, the only thing we had between us and them was wood. The next week felt like walking through a film that had been reshot in grainier stock. We installed cameras on the porch and the back, their lenses small pewter moons watching the yard. The installer was a young man from town who whistled too much and acted like he was done with the world. He left with a nod that suggested he didn't expect to find anything dramatic. People who live on farmland get used to the idea that most disturbances have reasonable answers. A lost driver, teenagers daring each other, a raccoon bold enough to tip a trash can. And yet, between the shed and the eastern fence, in the dawn light, the shape of that night felt like it had left residue on the air. I kept waking at odd hours to check that the doors were still locked, that the camera feed was still alive. Marta moved quieter than before, the two of us folding our routines around a new shape of watchfulness. For a few days, things returned to a cautious normal. We started to laugh a little about our exaggeration, the way people do to make fear bearable. But on the third day after the incident, a new detail thudded into our home like a stone through glass. I sat on the porch at dusk, a mug of coffee gone cold, watching the corn move in its slow, rivered way, when my phone chimed with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something, maybe the dull memory of that night, made me pick up. The voice on the other end was the precise mimic of Hank's laugh, a sound I'd heard my entire life, and then words, "You missed us the other night. We were right up at the window." My stomach hollowed. It's one thing to be mistaken in the dark, another thing entirely to be told, later, that someone had been inches away and chosen not to be seen. I called Hank. He answered, his voice bright, and where he was, out by the old feed mill. He'd been alone. He swore blind. He started to swear in the way men do when trying to be absolutely, boringly, unquestionably honest. I didn't do that. Evan, I was at my place. There was a clench in his voice that was not just from sleep. Our calls overlapped and failed, and left us with the same unsatisfying fact. There were people, others using voices like keys. That idea was worse than a physical threat. It felt like a theft of intimacy, a theft of our ability to tell friend from foe. We checked the camera footage the installer had set up. The grainy infrared showed the porch in midnight, tones black, gray, white. At 11:02 p.m., two blurs passed across the frame, slow and deliberate, hands outstretched like men measuring the walls. The audio, when the system captured it, was thin and warbling, nothing like how our ears had heard the night. So much of what had been terrifying was absent on the recording, soft as breath. But there was a moment, 1 second of static, and then a phrase that crawled beneath my skin. "We just need to use a phone." The clip ended on a silhouette at the window. No faces, no license plates, just shapes that might have been human, and a feeling that we'd been toyed with. That week became a careful choreography of light and lock. Marta put a thick bolt on the back door and bought a wind-up lantern for the workshop. Small actions that made us feel less hunted. I took to sleeping with the shotgun within an arm's reach, a ritual that both comforted and shamed me. When I did sleep, the dreams were ruined by small details. Hands without faces, the smell of rain under wet clothing, a voice that shifted like a radio. We tried to keep our lives practical and stubbornly ordinary. The fields needed tending. The cows had to be checked at the edge of the pastures. The mailbox had to be emptied. Out in the daylight, the world reasserted itself with the stubborn authority of chores and schedules, but at night the house kept secrets that felt like stains. On the 5th night after the incident, the farmhouse held its breath in that particular way it does when a storm is building. Marta was in the kitchen stacking dishes. I was checking feed lines in the barn when the gravel at the end of the lane rasped with tires. A truck pulled in Hank's truck, and I felt a reluctant swell of relief. He had told us he would sleep over if things didn't calm down. He came up the steps with mud on his boots and that same laugh, but it was smaller now. We joked awkwardly, the kind of half smiles people produce in rooms that have known fear. He stayed late into the night, then went to the guest room to sleep, promising to check the driveway every hour. At 2 a.m, while Marta slept like a small animal on the couch, something sharp and small sliced through the night air, the sound of a knuckled fist on the back door. It was measured, patient, like someone who wanted to be heard but not discovered. Lights flicked on in the house. Hank was up faster than I was. Men who have learned to move their bodies in the dark for farm work can become expert at emergency moves. We both moved to the kitchen window and watched the dark like it held decisions. The moon was a dull coin, and the yard lay pooled in silver gray. We could see a figure near the edge of the porch, its head bent, its hands busy with the latch. The figure was alone. It moved with the careful familiarity of someone who had been there before. Hank stepped out with his shotgun, boots speaking in the wet grass, and I followed with mine. When we reached the porch, the figure was gone. No footprint, no trace, just the porch light swinging from the wind. We checked the cameras and found the image of that night. Someone had walked the deck, paused at the back door, and then, as if on stage, they'd turned and called out in Hank's voice, "Open up!" Behind the call you could hear a second voice, lower, almost laughing. The footage had been cut, then resumed with someone walking away into the night. We rewound and watched the same few frames over and over until the motion blurred into meaninglessness. The sense of being hunted shifted. No longer merely men in the dark, but men who could steal voices and lay traps made of familiarity. After that, sleep came in short, jealous pieces. In the middle of the afternoon, my hands would tremble without reason. At night, the house felt interrupted, as if it had been edited and a few frames gone missing. The town feed store stocked extra bolts and bright LED floodlights. People asked if we were going to move. They said it in the way townspeople say hard things, with the attempt at practical distance. "Some folks don't like being watched," the hardware man said, leaning on the counter. He thought of teenagers, of drunks, of small-time vandals. None of those conjectures took into account the low organizing intelligence that had chosen to press its nose to our window and speak in the voice of a man we trusted. The worst part is what comes after the lights are installed, after the officer waves and says cameras, after the neighbor's truck sits in the gravel like a promise kept. The worst part is how quickly you realize that the world has room for certain nastiness, and that most of it operates within a set of ordinary hours. That knowledge softens into a new fear. Not that you will be physically harmed, though that fear is real, but that someone can sit in the margins of the night and fold themselves into your life by pretending they already belong there. Weeks crawled on. The corn grew taller, and our movements became more efficient. Harvest is implacable in its demands. We tried to fold the event into a set of sensible precautions. The cameras, the locks, the periodic check-ins with Hank. People in town brought us casseroles and said little. A gossiping kindness that never translated into effective action. The cops came again once to tell us about a transient who'd been seen on the highway. The description didn't match the shapes on our camera. Each time they left, the porch seemed a little thinner, as if someone had carried away more than we'd been willing to admit. One night, near the end of September, when the air had that brittle edge announcing the next season, the thing that had been circling us decided to show its hand. It started, as usual, with a small sound, a soft, repeated tapping on the kitchen window that faced the driveway. I had been in the barn, and Marta called me inside. There was nothing at first, only the shallow ripple of rain and the lower hum of insects, and then a voice that made my bones click like old wood. "Let me in, please." It was Hank's voice, perfect, intimate, laden with the cadence of so many years. And it was saying the thing that makes you flinch. It was the earnest, tired plea of a neighbor who had fallen into misfortune. By then, logic had sharpened into superstition. Do not open, do not respond, check the cameras. We watched the live feed with the kind of focus usually reserved for surgery. The infrared painted the porch in a world of white and black. And there, standing next to the stairs, were two figures. One seemed to hold something wrapped in fabric. The other was closer to the window. For the first time, the camera caught a detail we had missed before. The figures. Hands were not rough like farm hands. Hands, but oddly clean. Paler, where skin should have thickened from work. They moved with a patient, almost theatrical slowness, like people who understand the moment is a performance. I remember the smell before anything else. A rotten sweet odor of cloth left damp and under the sun too long. Something like old rags and rust. It crawled through the speakers in a way images cannot, and made the hairs on my arms rise into a brittle line. Marta's jaw worked. She swallowed. We kept calling Hank. The phone rang and rang and rang. No answer. At that point, panic felt too brittle to be useful. Instead, we did the old things. We turned on every outside light. We fired the shotgun into the field. Into the field, not toward anyone. And we shouted to scare them off. The noises we made were ridiculous and human and necessary. They left. When we finally pushed the door and stepped out with the officer who had arrived after another 20-minute crawl, there were depressions in the soft earth by the porch that suggested two people had stood knee-deep in the dark. There were no footprints beyond the deck, just those two prints, and then nothing. The officer picked up on the set of gloves someone had tossed near the hydrangeas, gloves too small for Hank, too new and thin for fieldwork. He bagged them. Later at the station, he said the cotton fibers were from a brand we could buy at any big box store, plantation issue grubby stuff that proved nothing and proved everything. After that night, the intrusions dwindled in frequency but never entirely stopped. Sometimes, in the deep no-clock hours, we'd wake to mimicry on the phone, the perfect timbre of Hank singing in the shower, an imitation of my mother's voice asking if I'd had supper. The human capacity for pattern finding can make monsters of coincidence, but it was a specific, targeted cruelty to have voices ripped out of context and used as weapons. We adapted. We created a protocol of secret phrases and small tests, tiny, intimate passwords that only someone in our circle would know. It was humiliating to be reduced to code words, but those codes worked like talismans. If someone called, We asked for a phrase only Hank would know, or a piece of trivia about the old feed mill that only he and I would have laughed about the week before. Months later, in the deep of winter, when the rows of corn were skeletons and the house steamed like a small beast against the cold, we watched the footage from that first night again. I wanted to see something new, to find a missed detail that would explain everything. Instead, the video showed the same hesitant shapes, the same truncated audio, the same absence where there should have been faces. There was one frame toward the end of the clip where the porch light caught a sliver of something reflective at the edge of the deck, an object that could be a watch face, a ring, or a shard of broken glass. And in the pause that followed, a sound that is now stored in my memory like a physical thing. Someone laughing, low and pleased, as if they had found an answer to a question only they had the right to ask. We never caught them. There was no dramatic confrontation, no cinematic reveal. The thing that stalked us seemed less interested in property than in proximity, near enough to watch, near enough to know the timbre of our voices, near enough to stand at the window and murmur our names into the dark. Life continued. The farm needed tending, bills had to be paid, the seasons kept to their calendar. But the wooden door, our thin, honest defense, changed in my mind from an incidental piece of architecture to the only fragile shield between a household and a stranger who understood how to twist familiarity into an instrument of terror. The final image that stays with me is small and domestic, and the kind of ordinary thing that lodges in nightmares. One evening years later, after the harvest and after the fences had been mended, and after the cameras were old and just part of the scenery, I was in the kitchen when I heard, faint as a memory, a knock at the front door. It was so ordinary, two polite raps, that for a second I forgot the weather, the cameras, the months of careful avoidance. My hand found the bolt out of habit. Marta looked at me. We both heard the echoes of that night in the sound, how quickly a knock can be reshaped into a threat. I thought of that man's voice, the way it had tried to press itself into our life. I thought of all the things that can fit through a knock: a friend, a delivery, a murderer, a stranger who knows the names you call your dog. We left the porch light on that night. We left the camera recording. I lay awake listening to the house breathe. Somewhere out among the rows the corn sighed and turned, as if nothing terrible had happened at all.